Alrighty then, welcome to everybody. My name is Daniel Stein. I'm one of the co-hosts for today's Let's Get Technical call. And here we are, April 24th. Welcome everyone. I hope everyone's well and safe and making it through these unprecedented times. It's extraordinary. And I know I have, and I'm sure everyone else has been trying to address and accommodate this new world of virtual living. I know it's not easy, but I think we're getting better at it. And I think that I'm hopeful that it won't last forever, but we'll have gone through this learning curve and that it will come out on the other side stronger, smarter, and better able to communicate on some of these kinds of platforms, which actually are quite a benefit for us to have here. So this is a continuation. We've been doing these calls since I think August of 2019, and been bringing people together for a while. Today, I'm particularly excited and gratified to have Shoma Saha with us, talk about the well-being in the nation efforts that she's been leading so adroitly for a while, and the intersection with our work at Stewards and a lot of other people on this call are undoubtedly strong and very exciting. And I got to know Shoma a number of years ago under the 100 Million Healthier Lives work, and our efforts at Stewards and the NIC kind of bumped into each other, and been sort of collaborating and talking and watching the development of the WIN network and all of the related amazing efforts that she's led and her team has led over there in the Alliance. And so I'm just delighted that we have an opportunity to sort of come together, share networks, and we've been having some conversations around how do we build collaboration. It seems more than ever now, the idea of being able to collaborate is so important. The problems are so large, the challenges are enormous, and the opportunities to make substantive systemic change are hopefully once in a lifetime, but they're upon us. And I think we get to do that more and better when we're doing it together. And so I'm delighted about that, and looking forward to today's conversation and ongoing ones. I have a few slides I want to just open up with as we get started before I turn it over to Soma, and we'll have some conversation. So Mike, thank you very much. So now it almost seems like most of this housekeeping is second nature. Everybody, I can't imagine anybody on this call has not been on too many Zoom calls already, from dinners to virtual cocktail parties to actual work at home. So I think the etiquette is well known. Zoom continues to add some features and functions to the platform, and there's the amazing clap and thumbs up little icons you can choose to select, which go wild on that one if you like. That should be fun. We do try to schedule as much interaction as we can. Obviously, there's some great content that someone will be sharing with us today, but designed to engage in the conversation. Obviously, questions through the chat panel, raising your hand, or as necessary, just break into the conversation as the spirit moves you to do that. We're recording the session today as always, and you can find it on the hub. You have to sign up for the hub. If you're not, there's a sign up information there. You can see it. It's pretty straightforward. As I said, you can then binge watch all of the recordings. I think we probably have 30 odd recordings, get up to speed on all of the latest trends out there on the hub. And this is new for us. We're live streaming on YouTube, so welcome rest of the world. Hopefully you'll find information, insight, and inspiration today as we go forward. So Mike, could you advance, please? So our agenda today is pretty straightforward. I'm going to do a little bit of intro, just a tiny bit on the NIC and kind of where we're headed on a couple of things. 2 quick polls to sort of identify where the participants in the call today are at. And then we'll dive into most of the time here on the network. And Shoma will be presenting to that and giving us an overview of the lay of the land and where we're at on this really exciting approach to measuring well-being, which I think is really wonderful and exciting there. So if you advance one more, Mike, I think we have our, oh yeah, just a couple of upcoming things. So we have meetings scheduled or webinar scheduled actually through almost the end of May. There's a couple here. Obviously, next week is a unique one we're holding with the HIT Connect folks. That was supposed to be an in-person conference in Baltimore that got postponed. So we're actually hosting a online version of what was going to be a pretty ambitious review of some of the major national interoperability initiatives, Gravity, Da Vinci, Karen Alliance, and our Project Unify. For those of you who are not familiar with those particular terms, it's a lot of the work on the healthcare side and the Office of National Coordinator looking at creating a structure for better integration. And we'll actually have some folks from Indiana talking about their work in particular around COVID. So it should be a jam-packed experience. And with that, it'll actually be 2 hours because we have so much material to cover. And then following that, the following week, we have the folks from the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality. So they will be talking about some of the evidence that they've produced around the opioid crisis. And from my experience, mostly on the human services side, AHRQ is a well-kept secret. Many folks, I mean, on the healthcare side, on the academic side, research side, just a treasure trove of research of the federal agency to set the standards and metrics. Within the human service side, not so much. And I encourage you to, and we'll be talking more about that going forward, but it's just a treasure trove of data and information. And so they are excited about sharing that with us as well. And so we'll have some other ones following that as well. So if you advance, Mike. We're just going to do 2 quick polls here. One just to get oriented to who's in the room, and just go ahead and what areas we've broken this into 6 domains. The work that the way we look at the world between human services, public health, education, public safety. Go ahead and choose the area you mostly focus on in your work life, and then we'll just check it out. We'll just spend a couple of minutes, 30 seconds doing this. And I look forward to your participation. It's always interesting to see where folks are hailing from in terms of their orientation. Last week we had folks in the Office of National Coordinator talking about the FAST project, and there were a lot of people from healthcare in there, which was terrific to see. So Michael, are we ready to publish yet?
Yes, it has slowed dramatically. Last call. Okay.
There we go. Great. Let's just see that. Okay, thanks. Great. Almost 40% from human services, a lot of folks from public health, 55%. Great to see education representative, a measly 2% for public safety. We got to get those folks here more. And then at least we got some representation from emergency medical response and healthcare IT coming in at 25% of the representatives. So you have a sense there of the part of the audience, which is great to see. And I'm glad to see most of the domains represented. I've got a little bit more work to do on that. So one of the next quick poll is to do with where you're hailing from. Nope, that's the same one. There should be another second one or the 4th one there, Mike.
Yep, it's coming. Sorry, it's making me relaunch. Here we go.
Okay. There you go. So just what part of the world you guys live in? And apologize if we don't get your particular region correct. There is an other option, so should you hail from another galaxy or solar system, let us know that.
You can add it to the chat bar as well.
Yes, right. You can share that with us there as well. Midwest. Didn't have a Midwest option. I apologize. Canada, great. Okay, our friends north of the border. Wonderful. Toronto. And we've got a New York. So
Another North. Oh, Egypt, there we go. All right.
Okay, let's launch.
We're back to where we were with the last poll. Up, winding down. Going to close it out here.
Okay. Great. Well, we've got representatives from across the country. That's great to see. It's a little earlier on the West Coast, or it's a little earlier on the Northwest, I take it. But it's good to see representation from all across the country. A little fewer higher in Northeast and some other folks from other parts of the country there. So thank you very much for that. If you move ahead now a little bit to the next one. Just a minute on NIC for folks who are new to the call here. So NIC is a community of networks, and we refer to it as that way, recognizing that every domain, every sector has its own networks within it. And one of the things that when we started this up a couple of years ago was to really think about cross-domain networks and how we can help organize and help sort of ensure the communication between them. And we focused on 6 domains, which we've talked about, which you actually responded to, which is an attempt to sort of organize the world into 6 domains. There are certainly ones that should be called out separately, but we wanted to try to organize it in this way. We wrote a paper on it off to the right there, you'd see. And what's important about this is the idea of really bringing people together across multiple domains. I think that people generally recognize that, the importance of that. Some of them are obvious between health and human services. Once you get into more complex problems or challenges, whether or not they're natural disasters or opioids or now this pandemic, the need to really exchange information, exchange communication across those domains becomes all the more important. One of the observations we made is that each of the sectors is working hard to improve their communication within their domain. And there's a lot of those efforts that are actually fairly common or could be common, and that those efforts could be connected more consciously. And as a result, we would find potentially more ability to share information if we were sharing the appropriate standards, being synced up on legal confidentiality issues, understanding language and communication. And so that's been in many ways our focus. And we are very grateful to the Kresge Foundation for supporting this work a couple of years ago, and we continue to push forward with it. So I encourage you to look more about that. This was when we really started to form this. This was when we had the great fortune of really talking with Shoma and Peter Eckert and Dash and all in, and kind of have been sort of tracking each other along the way here. So kind of a nice culmination coming together again here. One more slide, please, if you advance. So one of the things we are focused on over the next 10 months is where are we going? So obviously there's a huge amount of interest and effort focused on addressing the issues now. I mean, even just trying to figure out how many people are infected, the demographic information, obviously the issues of health inequity are sort of soaring to the top. It's becoming obvious. The issues are very much consistent with what we've seen for years and years and years. And so obviously the attention on the right now is critically important, but we also recognize that we need to be looking a little longer term in terms of both the problems and also the opportunities to make adjustments as we go forward. And it seems to me, based on the recession, last recession and 9/11 and historical times, that these kinds of world events, or national events, in this case, world events, present opportunities for people to think a little bit differently. And so what we're trying to do is bring people together around this idea of where is the puck headed, and can we track that over the next 10 months, bring people together to really develop and design and to share an actionable roadmap informed by information technology, informed by the ability to share information more effectively, both locally and regionally and nationally. And so we're putting forward this idea of a national action agenda informed, and we'll be focusing on that over the next number of months. More of these webinars will be focused on that kind of conversation, elements of that conversation, and hopefully other collaborations who are participating. So when we do actually get together, and we're hoping to actually meet in person at the end of January, a bold statement, actually try to go out and create an event. We'll have an agilely developed agenda that hopefully is representative of the country. and help drive some of the changes. If we can change that, that aircraft carrier trajectory a little bit, we have tremendous opportunity to make some of the substantial systematic changes that we've all been talking about for a long time. And that's actually a perfect segue into the main topic today and the main presenter. Go on beyond that. And I said some about Michelle already starting this, and really have had just an amazing opportunity to learn from her and track how and what they're doing and what ways they're doing it. And so as we get started, I just wanted to, you see her her bio there. It's impressive. And if you know her, you know that she's impressive behind the bio. But I want to just ask you what a little bit about your journey getting into this work and this collaboration work, just to share with folks as we start this up. So when did that bug bite you, so to speak?
You know, Daniel, I first had the privilege of doing my master's work in the second poorest region in the second poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, which is the Rupununi region of Guyana, while I was a master's student in public health. And that's where I wrote my master's thesis, and had the privilege of watching both during that time and then over the next 10 years as a community utterly transformed its health outcomes in a region of 15,000 people across 33,000 square miles. And in that context, they didn't actually distinguish between, I mean, it was teams of community health workers, villagers, teachers. This thing we call cross-sector collaboration was just how you did community. And so I think I always thought that was how you did community. So when I came and my first job was to start a new community health center in the Harvard system, I didn't know you weren't supposed to do that because it was my first job out of residency. So of course, went to the mayor and the public health nurse and I mean, it was just the schools, et cetera. I didn't know how you would ever change the health and well-being of a community without everybody you needed who had access to that community. And so I think we started interoperable data systems, but also the collaborations that could power action together from the beginning. So I guess that's my story.
Well, that's totally fitting. If you just assume it is, then everyone else to adjust to that vision. And like, why are we not doing it that way? It doesn't make sense.
Well, it was also just a lot easier to get to outcomes when you have everybody on the team that you really need. It's very hard if you're a primary care clinician and you are going to see someone for 4 15-minute visits a day for an hour a year, when they're going to spend 5,000 hours in the context of their community. And so you really need those teammates.
So as we move into the presentation here with that observation and then the stark reality that the rest of the world didn't see the world the way you were necessarily coming to it, I guess, what have you seen as a, you know, as you've been climbing that or pursuing that or going through it, what have been the kind of the main challenge that you felt, or some of the main challenges you felt as you try to make change from within inside that system?
Yeah, you know, I went from creating a clinic and a community health center to transforming one of the Harvard health systems with one of the public safety net systems to coming to the Institute for Healthcare Improvement to lead 100 million lives. And I think one thing I've noticed is that we have enough money in the US to stay in silos. And when there's resources, we protect those silos. When we face challenges that we can't face alone, that's when we begin to actually come together. And this moment of COVID, of this pandemic, is just one example of that. But I think those who have been around for a while see that over and over again. You know, when we launched 100 million, with the recognition that no one had all the answers, what we needed was a way to begin to even connect the people who held a piece of the puzzle around the globe about how we truly improve population health, well-being, and equity. We would often ask a question about, you know, what could we do together that we couldn't do alone, with the belief that unprecedented collaboration could lead to unprecedented results. And as we went through that and created a network that reached over 500 million people, where things that were developed by a school teacher in Scotland that reduced childhood obesity by 50% or more, that scaled to 65 countries, or interventions that led to 50% reductions in youth homelessness and scaled across whole states in Wyoming and others. What we learned was that the relationships and connections were just as important, and that there were several system things we could do to enable that, to get rid of the barriers that stood in the way. And of course, money and how it flows in silos is one of those. A second was data, and even how we began to see the world from our individual things that we measured versus how we could begin to see, at the end of the day, who is the person and what is the community, and how do we organize ourselves to meet the need of the person. Our measures follow our view of the world. And I think so much of WIN has been really about how do we see and improve the well-being of people and places with that lens to equity, and organize ourselves differently if we really want to achieve outcomes, if we're serious about that.
So there's been a real organic growth from your original perception into the opportunities and the gaps, and just continuing to roll forward and drive those conversations and metrics, which is, you know, that's the definition of an entrepreneur or a change maker, is just keep moving forward, as it were.
Well, right? what I learned in Guyana was that from the indigenous community that was there, and this amazing Baha'i Community Health Partnership, was when you solve the problem at hand, you'll discover the real problem you need to solve, and then it's your job to figure out how to do that. And if you follow my career, it's really about peeling one onion, piece of the onion.
Right. Years ago, I was introduced to somebody in another lifetime who lived in Washington State. It introduced me to Walla Walla sweets. Have you ever heard of a Walla Walla sweet? Folks from Washington, if they're on the call here, would know that. They are onions that you can actually eat like an apple. They're so sweet and delicious. So anytime I hear about peeling the onion, I always think about Walla Wallas. And the sales manager sent me a case of them after I returned from Washington to enjoy. And I just want to share that sort of non sequitur thought with you, because it brings up a really kind of a wonderful taste in my mouth, actually, which is for what it's worth there.
That's lovely.
So I want to, just as we get started, I want to just say welcome to Peter Eckert. I think Peter's on the call with us, and we've been having some wonderful conversations, again, in the spirit of collaboration. The work that Peter and RWJF and Dash and All In has been doing as well has been terrific. And as we look around the world and try to identify other collaboratives who are moving in the same or similar direction, you know, we're trying to open the doors and say, boy, this is an opportunity for us to really work together in ways that are complementary. And so I'm excited about Peter's participation as well, and many others on the call here. So Peter, if you're here for a second, I know you're on mute, just maybe say hello. If not, we'll catch you during the rest of the conversation. Oh, there you go. Hey.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel, and it's nice to see folks. I'm a big fan of Shoma and the work that she's been leading that has now led to the WIN measures and We in the World. So I'm just really excited to listen in on stuff, even though this is some of the content is stuff that I've been talking with Shoma about. I always learn something new, and especially for folks like a lot of you on the call, where you're operating in a whole bunch of different places, it's really important to be constantly challenged on how can we continue to drive these measures to as many people and places as possible. So I'm really happy to be listening in with everybody else today.
Thanks, Peter. And back to you, Shoma. I think the slides are teed up. So
Perfect.
Take it away, and we'll engage in the conversation as we go forward.
Thank you so much, Daniel, and thank you, Peter. It's been such a pleasure. And what I'd say is that I think you guys all know this, but that they're two of the best system thinkers and some of the people that I've had the great privilege of not just collaborating with, but Peter has really help to support some of the thinking around how do we actually make collaboration and data across sectors real on the ground level, just as Daniel's been thinking about how to do that at the system levels. It's just a special privilege to be with all of you today. And if you go to the next slide. So I always say when you boil down everything about why I do what I do, it's asking the question about these two boys. If you may, some of you may have seen their picture in the article. There were two kindergartners who got their dads to take them to a barber shop one day to get their head shaved because they were best friends. And they were convinced that if they got their head shaved the same way, they could trick their kindergarten teacher into believing they were each other and do pranks on her. I always say it's one of those, documented cases of racism as an acquired disease. But what we do know is that inequities are in the data every day, that these two boys could grow up 2 miles apart and have up to a 25-year gap in their life expectancy. Thomas on the right might not live long enough to see their grandchild graduate from high school, and Sean is likely to. Thomas might not survive the COVID pandemic if it hits him, and is likely to lead a life of chronic stress that gives him a 40-fold higher risk of developing prediabetes and diabetes. And I think until we can begin to understand what drives these outcomes, until we keep peeling back the onions to say what would really make a difference. And I was a vice president at the IHI until fairly recently, and we'd always ask about the 5 whys. When you keep asking about the 5 whys, we get to the way in which we're structured and the way our systems work. And so today I'll share about measures as just one element of getting us all to begin to think about what's needed for Sean and what's needed for Thomas and what it looks like for us to get the outcomes we need. Next slide. So if you, thank you. We know
little late,
that,
yeah, I think. But.
Oh, thank you for warning me about that. I'll say next slide a little sooner. One of the things that became clear in our work in 100 Million was the relationship between the well-being of people, places, and equity. Now, this has become apparent to any of you who's following the news, and if you haven't seen the WIN Digest from this week, it focuses on this. Great Commonwealth Fund article talks about inequities in deaths in the context of Corona, with 70% of deaths in African Americans in some places, and certainly disproportionate in African American and Native American and Hispanic families. And of course, if you look at why, you see many are frontline workers and have much higher levels of chronic illness. And that chronic illness comes from toxic levels of stress. It's not because people intentionally don't want to be healthy. It's really, when you begin to look at maps of childhood obesity on the right and economic hardship on the left, those maps look the same. And what you see is a biologic stress response that comes from growing up in conditions of toxic stress, that if you were to take that right-hand map 20 years down the line, you'd see that becoming the map of poorly controlled diabetes, and then 20 years later, the map of premature death. And I think so much of what we need to think about is how this COVID a pandemic actually just really, it makes clear the fault lines of our society. And any conversation about data that doesn't begin to address the well-being of people, the well-being of places, and equity is a piece of the conversation where there's a piece missing. Next slide. So how can we do that? And is there a way that we can begin to think about people, places, and the systems of society that drive those outcomes, that reproducibly make that map, which happened to be in LA, but the one before was in New Orleans. I could show you one from every single geography just about that you may be in. You're all from all around the world. I encourage you to Google life expectancy map, and if you haven't already. The real question is, how do we address this at all 3 of these levels? Now, some of us are in healthcare or social human services or in business, et cetera. We care a lot about people. Others of us are in public health or community development, et cetera, and we care about places. But both of us need to care about the systems of society. You can't improve the well-being of people without improving the well-being of places or really make the advances we need without improving the well-being of the systems of society and their configuration. Next slide. And so you've heard enough about me, so let's keep going. So today I'd like to cover what the well-being in the nation measures are and why we should care, how these measures might help us to measure social determinants and support connections across sectors, and how they can be used in real time to improve population and community health. I'm going to be going pretty fast, but please chat in stuff. I'll be looking at the chat, and my friends over at Stewards of Change and Nick have promised to lift up your questions, or if you're putting comments on the live stream, please make those, and we will address them. I'll address them either during or soon after this call, the presentation. Next slide. So the first question I have is a question for you. Which of these is most important to you when it comes to identifying measures based on where you sit? Because a lot of what we were trying to do is really think from the perspective of, as we develop the well-being in the nation measures, who's going to be using these measures, especially at the community level, and how can we make life easier for them if they're doing that? No, go ahead and put up the poll. So you can choose up to 3, but what do you care most about when it comes to measurement? Knowing that measurement is just one small part.
So we'll give a couple folks a couple minutes to kind of read through them and think about it, and then choose your choices here.
And please put your other choices in the chat.
We're about halfway, almost at 50%.
Great. So as you think about this, Mark is saying measures that drive change. Excellent. These were all the kinds of things we were paying attention to as we were talking with people. And often, Mark, it was measures that drive change in different time horizons. Some people needed things to change within 6 months to a year, and others needed things to change over decades. And knowing that how we have those balance of leading and lagging indicators. What are measures of real outcomes? Excellent.
Last call for responses. We're up to 65%. Okay, here you go.
Uma summed it up well. She said all of these choices are relevant depending on the audience, and it looks like you all agree you're pretty well split across them, but have a special interest in what facilitates collaboration across sectors. Now, of course, we know that having common measures is just one element, but Health and Human Services knew this was something that was going to be important. Go ahead, if you go to the next slide. And tasked the National Committee on Vital and Health Statistics to develop measures that would support collaboration across sectors. Oh, this is for later on.
Sorry.
No, it's okay.
Okay, next slide.
Thank you. So Eric is saying I'd add measures of health and longevity. For instance, that there's longevity varies by 14 years in Phoenix. And Barbara says, unfortunately, much of this fails to bring those impacted to the table during the discussion for me. And those are exactly the kinds of things, Barbara, that we were thinking about as well. So the WIN measures, what is the WIN measure? So the WIN measures, it offers a set of common measures that were co-developed with over 100 organizations federal agencies, and local communities, including community residents with experience of inequities, who then went and actually tested some of the measures that were emerging to identify what worked for them. I think it's one of the times where we really set up a process where the process would have equity a lot, as much as we could, along with the outcomes, because we wouldn't really have a thought that these measures would improve outcomes if we didn't do that. In addition, it included measures across every sector that were sourced from those sector, and with a landscape analysis that was a cross-sector landscape analysis. It was the framework for this was developed by the National Committee on Vital and Health Statistics, and then 100 Billion Healthier Lives facilitated the process of developing measures together with everyone. It was the focus of this was helping to support communities at the sub-county level, and was coordinated with other major national measurement efforts, including the National Quality Forum, but many others such as county health rankings and roadmaps, US News and World Report's Healthy Communities rankings, City Health Dashboard, and others. This was really about people coming together to say, how can we come together and create and speak with a common voice about what matters. Next slide. So NCVHS, for those who don't know it, is a federal advisory committee that reports to the Secretary of Health and Human Services, and was charged by the Secretary to identify multi-sector measures to support population and community health and to address the social determinants of health. Next slide. Stuart is asking about the grain of the measures. So the NCVHS and the WIN measures focus on sub-county measures to the lowest level of detail possible. And so measures that are available and useful and important to communities that were at the sub-county level were prioritized for selection, especially zip code and census level measures. Thank you for the question. In addition, what we realized was that for many community-based organizations, they needed to actually have measures they could use in real time. And the identification of people-reported measures that they could rapidly use, including people-reported outcome measures, as well as measures that were standardly available, helped to make up the balance of what we sought. And really, a big part of this was identifying those use cases, doing that landscape analysis across sectors, identifying what was missing, so that if you were a single mom with 3 kids, you might say, I don't know a lot about everything, and I don't know about everything about measures, but I care a lot about the safety of my neighborhood, and I know a lot about my child's education system. She could look at what the measures were, and she could say, I think these are important, but she could also write in, this is important, that isn't anywhere there. And we'd send measurement experts to find a validated measure because it was prioritized by a community resident. Cycle 2 was prioritization, then evaluation. And then there was a process of going back to each sector for expert validation and then community testing in actual communities. And then finally, aligning the measures with related measurement initiatives, including Healthy People 2030, that was going on at the same time. Next slide. So what resulted was the well-being of the nation measures, which are broken up into core measures, leading indicators, and the full flexible set. The core measures are divided into 9 simple measures related to the well-being of people, the well-being of places, and some of the systems that drive equity. The leading indicators are related to 12 domains and associated subdomains related to determinants of health that include leading and lagging indicators, a balance of upstream, midstream, and downstream indicators, as well as measures that were truly work across and were sourced across sectors. But what we said was, while leading indicators had to have great data availability across the country and with a priority at the sub-county level, it all had to be valid to make it on this list. What we said was, if we knew everything we need to know, we wouldn't be where we are as a country. So how could we create room for those innovative measures where maybe we don't have the data availability, such as, for instance, a perception of everyday racism, which in Dave Williams's data seems to indicate takes 5 years off your lifespan, or a sense of purpose and meaning, or a social isolation and loneliness, knowing that there's emerging evidence that drives outcomes, especially in different populations, how can we make those part of a developmental measure set so that what we have isn't one set of measures to rule them all, but rather a learning measurement system that as we learn what works, we can collectively move these forward. Daniel, yes, there was cross-check with EHRs and clinical measures, but the priority here in the health domain, that was particularly important. But this was truly a multi-sector measure. So the included measures of everything, all of those 6 domains of NIC that you talk about, and more that emerged as important in communities.
Right.
And then, and of course, included healthcare and public health measures. So 9 core measures for the that were identified related to the well-being of people, the well-being of places, and equity. It turned out that one simple measure from the business sector proved to be the most important thing we could ask that related to the well-being of people, and that was how people felt about their own lives. And we'll talk more about this measure, Cantrell's letter, in a bit. But this proved to be one of the runaway successes, was a leading indicator that moved within 6 months. It made sense to people, both at the community level and at the national level. And it turned out to be highly correlated with everything from absenteeism and workforce productivity to morbidity, mortality, and cost. When you combined it with life expectancy, which I think Stuart had pointed out, someone in the chat had pointed out earlier, that led to a very powerful configuration of a robust available lagging indicator as well as a leading indicator that was available at the sub-county level for each. For the well-being of places, a Healthy Communities Index was chosen across a range of things: food, housing, transportation, et cetera, community vitality, belonging, et cetera, that make up a healthy community. But when we went to multiple measurement groups and asked an open-ended question, if there was a single question you could ask or single measure you could choose for the well-being of a community, what would you choose? Multiple groups chose child poverty, because they said it was the biggest predictor of how a community was configured in terms of its education system, in terms of base inequities, in terms of language access. It predicted all kinds of other things that it correlated with. And then in terms of equity, was really then the differences in subjective well-being, years of potential life gain, and systems such as income inequality and graduation rates, and then differences by demographic variables such as race, place, gender, educational level, language, sexual identity, etc. Mark mentions that single question about how people perceive their health and wellness has decades of evidence. It does, and it is under asked, though. One of the exciting things is CMS took this and said, wait a minute, maybe that's what we ought to use as part of our numerator for value, given the validity behind it. If we really want to drive improvement in population health, maybe we should have a measure that actually is deeply person-centered and predicts morbidity, mortality, and cost. Next slide. So this is Cantrell's letter. For those who haven't seen it, you can use both that single question or the second question as well, and we recommend using both. And you have come to use both in our work. But the question is incredibly simple. Imagine a ladder where the bottom is your worst possible life and the top is your best. Where would you put yourself now? Where would you put yourself 5 years from now? These 2 questions have been administered by Gallup 2.7 million times in 150 countries. It's mode flexible, meaning you could do it by paper, you could do it by phone, you could do it by internet, it doesn't matter. It's highly validated. It correlates with all of the things I was mentioning earlier. It's super useful for risk stratification for people who care about that. It turns out that from these 2 questions, you can calculate the percent of people thriving. That ends up being about your top 3.5% of the population and has much higher rate of morbidity, mortality, and cost. If you're 5 and 6, you're struggling. And if you're 4 or below, you're suffering, especially if you think things aren't going to get better in the future. From that, you can also calculate the percent of people with hope. And all of these 2 measures are available with the breakdowns in terms of age, sex, race, ethnicity, place, etc. And this has always been available, but because we never collaborated across sectors, this isn't something that we were able to use. Claire, that's a great question about child well-being. So depending on the age of the child, you can't, but for youth well-being, it absolutely works. So it's been tested in 13 and older. Now, underneath these Cantor's ladder questions, and I'll share with you in a little bit about how early adopters have been using some of these measures in the field. If you go to the next slide. I should say that Cantor's ladder question was recommended by the OECD. It's part of the World Happiness Index already, and it was recently recommended by the National Academies as a leading indicator for Healthy People 2030 as well. Now, in terms of the WIN leading indicators, now underneath, if you think of those, the well-being of people, the well-being of places, and equity as those 9 measures as sort of the overall outcomes, these are then what are the drivers of those outcomes. So around, there's of course demographics, but community vitality and belonging, economy, education, environment and infrastructure, food and agriculture, health, housing, equity, public safety, transportation, and of course, other questions around well-being. These are driver measures that support what might improve those outcomes and come from those sectors, developed with those sectors. Adrian, you can get access to all of this in the public domain, both the measure set, but also the data for every community in the country, down to the sub-county level to where the data is available if you go to winmeasures.org. And maybe we can, Peter, would you be able to put that into the link, chat for me? Next slide. And this is a picture of the site. You can see, again, you can download the report and get the measures, but you can actually see how the measures look. And wherever there is an equity breakdown, it's available. This was all created in the public domain and made available because it was truly done on behalf of the National Committee on Vital and Health Statistics and as part of 100 Million Lives. And this for the 100+ organizations and communities that were part of this, when we went to release the measures, they said, I remember it was one of those moments where I was quite taken aback because people said, wait, you seem to think this is over. I'm like, oh, no, we need your help to, use the measures and to disseminate. They were like, no, wait a minute. We finally, there's no context where across federal agencies and local communities and national organizations, we can make decisions together. Most of us who tested this already adopted this. Now that we actually have common measures we'd like to form a network to be able to use the measures. Matt, that's a great question. We don't have an open API, though we're putting it all in the commons, which does. And so that might be the way that you can get most of them there. One of the things we're working on is building that interoperable system that anyone can use in a way that's equitably available to all communities. Next slide. This is the leading indicator slide from the recommendation for the National Academies, which did its own independent evaluation for measures that they recommend for Healthy People 2030. And if you look at their list of leading indicators, you can see the strong correlation with the WIN measures as part of that set. Next slide. So these are early adopters of the WIN measures. This is absolutely out of date by now, but you can see that it truly represents everyone from media like US News and World Report to American Heart Association, national aging agencies, numerous health systems, states, federal agencies, and others have become adopters of the slides. And of course, many 100 Million Lives partners have helped to promote and support them in what they are doing. The Community Commons has integrated it as well. And this has been truly not any one organization's efforts. This is truly a we creating a data ecosystem or a measurement ecosystem that we can all together learn and improve. Next slide. So what does this look like and how have people used it? Well, I have to tell you, some of the ways people have used it are not at all what I would have imagined. When healthcare providers first began implementing it, they actually said, wait a minute, these measures are really useful to me in my coaching with people. And a bunch of mental health providers integrated it into their intake processes. That's not what I would have guessed, but they said it's super useful. Like, it's not such a charged question, are you suicidal, etc. but it gives people a sense of their life and lets me have a whole person conversation. Primary care providers said the same thing. And the ability to say you could do motivational interviewing using the ladder of where you are and where you might wish to be and what would take you there. That's not an indication we would have guessed would be useful. It was useful for risk stratification by all kinds of people in real time, as well as at the population planning level in terms of what resources you would need to support people. And I'll share an example of the use of that in Delaware in the context of COVID in just a moment. Of course, it was very useful to identify equity populations, and it was administered to 20,000 people in Fox Cities, Wisconsin. And there, what they realized was that only 8% of Native Americans and 20% of African Americans thought they were thriving compared to everybody else in their geography. And that led them to realize that they needed to have serious conversations about, as a community, about how they're inclusive both interpersonally and in terms of their structures and systems. They in other places, for instance, the Administration for Community Living funded the National Councils on Aging to look at this for older adults. And in Baltimore, about 20,000 of those were taken, and that led to significant investments in programming for older adults as it revealed their lack of social support, loneliness, et cetera. It's been used in evaluation, tons of community health needs assessments, as well as population level surveillance. Next slide. Daniel, the metrics, many of them have begun using this as a guide, and we'll talk about that as a triage guide. It's for really getting resources that people need to people in real time in the context of COVID, and we'll get into that. So I told you a little bit about the WIN network that's formed, that moving not just the measures, but the policies that would need to change, as well as the narrative change that needs to go with these measures to say, actually, we can look at the well-being of real people. Next slide. And here's an example of a small homeless shelter that began using this in downtown, in Skid Row, Los Angeles. And there they were doing a program for, they'd adapted the diabetes prevention program for homeless women with diabetes that were staying at the shelter. And with control groups for people who were, for women who had gotten housed, and controlling for that, they found that as they co-designed this program with women experiencing homelessness, they saw 92% improve their blood pressure, 44% improved their A1C. All of that was really exciting. But actually the measures that the clinicians and the women cared about the most was that within 6 months, they saw a 30% decline in the percent of women who were suffering and an increase in the percent of women thriving. Like, that felt meaningful and real to people. Next slide. In Delaware, this is sort of the configuration of the measures, and you can see that the lighter you are, the worse you are in this case. Next slide. What you begin to see, Delaware had applied these measures across the board as they thought about the cross-sector collaboration to support the people with mental health and addictions. Their cross-sector collaborative included police, corrections, human services, the mental health agencies, every hospital and emergency room, all community behavioral health providers, foster care, et cetera, where they were engaging people, et cetera. And you could see the WIN measures in both the outcome measures, such as improving well-being of people suffering from mental health and addictions and their families, improvement in mental health and addictions outcomes, which is in the health domain, i.e. reduced deaths of despair and incidents of despair, years of life gained, as well as reconnection to jobs, economy, education, et cetera. And then thriving resilient communities. The WIN measures gave them a way to collaborate and choose common measures that made sense for all of them. And they were seen all through with process measures in these. This was already a statewide thing that was going on as police were diverting people into treatment, et cetera. And 9 months into this or so, COVID happened. Next slide. And what they quickly realized was they were seeing huge increases in unemployment applications, going from 1,000 in 2 weeks to 30,000, which in the last 2 weeks of March. They expect levels to exceed the Great Depression by the end of they did exceed that. They were seeing spikes in social isolation with social distancing. And for people with mental health and addictions, it was especially bad because they lost access to their peer supports. And many mental health providers in the meantime lost access to their appointments. And because telehealth appointments were paid at a much lower reimbursement rate, many of them had difficulty keeping their doors open. Next slide. What they were able to do in Delaware, as they saw the increasing anxiety in the population, the level of social isolation and how much people would be at risk, they figured that at the state level, they had the ability to take care of, with all their resources, the highest risk people and some of the medium risk people. But they needed to rapidly identify who those were, and not only through safety questions, because it just wasn't going to be enough. They needed to have a way of seeing the whole person in terms of job loss, trauma, et cetera, because there was high levels of stress. Now, this data has now been replicated in by Gallup and ShareCare that just surveyed 100,000 households in the US in the last month that showed those increased levels of stress in Ontario, across the province, as well as by Kaiser Family Foundation in California, really showing the increase in economic stress and insecurity and the correlation with overall well-being, and then the correlation of that with mental health outcomes. Next slide.
Hey,
So in
Shama,
Delaware, yeah.
Can I just interrupt 1 second here? I'm intrigued by Delaware's success in doing this. Can you pause for a moment and share with us a little bit about, I know they have outstanding leadership, but how did you get them, or how did they come to the measures in a way that it sounds like they really embedded them in their workflow and in their ethos in terms of doing that? Because I think there's oftentimes hey, that's a great idea. The house is on fire over here. We'll get to that when we get to that. So a bit of that would be interesting at the moment before, as we kind of move into those pieces.
Sure. The We in the World team had been accompanying Delaware to really help them take up and plan a population health approach, and helping them see they can't actually, it's the same population across corrections and foster care and emergency rooms, et cetera, that the people who were, that to really see and understand that the graduates of foster care were going to be their next high risk population if they didn't do those transitions well. Then as those sectors began measuring, they quickly began to see, wait a minute, in corrections, everybody's suffering. That's crazy when they realized it. And that made them say, oh, how can we become the biggest actual provider of treatment for mental health and do great handoffs? So people got motivated by actually using the data in their context. For police, the years of life gain was like playing a game. Hey, we prevented an overdose, just gained 40 years of life. It was like you could ratchet up your numbers. So finding ways to make it motivating for people across sectors was, I think, important. And then the risk stratifying, it helped people to see, wait a minute, if I'm in the emergency room and I'm sending this person over, if this person is in the suffering category or struggling and they're going to be at much higher risk, it matters to me that person gets extra care and follow up and really gets to where they need to. So it made people's job a little bit easier ultimately, even though we faced the same measurement resistance at the beginning until people began to actually use it and began to do it. Maryland is absolutely aligned with Delaware's efforts to become a trauma-informed state, and is being combined with ACEs as part of their new CRF that the DSEM is using across the board. And Stuart, these have been written up. They're not on the Win Measures site, though. That's a great idea. We should probably do that in our next go. And they are written up in a number of other contexts. Next slide. So in the context of COVID, I want to make sure we get to the rest of the conversation too, but what we did was took 5 of the questions. They already had, now in another context, I would include the question about physical and mental health, but they were already asking a lot of questions about mental health, so we didn't want to duplicate efforts there. But we asked the 2 overall well-being questions: financial security, loneliness, and social support, which meant if you had a friend or family member when you needed them. Next slide. And which of these measures would you predict are the most important in terms of predicting who would be suffering, struggling, or otherwise?
Most important. Good, you can choose more than one.
You can choose more than one. We were not totally unfair.
I think we're getting to the last couple percent. Give you a few more seconds. Okay, I'll end polling.
Economic insecurity. You are very right. So overall well-being and economic insecurity did prove to be the most useful measures and predictive of the other pieces. Next slide.
1 second, I just need to get rid of the poll. Okay.
You're doing a great job, Michael.
Hey,
Thanks.
So, yeah, caretaker support is super important to me. Absolutely. So I want you, in looking at this next set of slides, I want you to look at the suffering number of 2.5%. This was the baseline in Delaware. And we'd happened to remember we'd been doing this for a bit. We'd had a sample, it was a pretty small sample, but from a mental health and addictions clinic. You go to the next slide. To show that it was that number of about 2.5 and then 3% was sort of the baseline. If you follow that, orange is suffering, gray is struggling, and yellow is thriving. So if you look at what happened, this was in the first 2 weeks as they stood up a real-time data system so that as people called, as they reached out as an agency across all of their care managers, they began asking those questions. And what they saw was that there was seemed to be, you can't really know for sure because it's not as true population to population, but from baseline, the percent of people who are suffering had gone from, was now 15% in this population. And when you asked about why that might be, next slide, which was the secondary questions, what you saw was that in fact, 38% of people were without hope, meaning that they saw that they were going to be worse off in the future, even in 5 years, than they were today. Next slide. Sorry, and the reason that hope piece mattered so much is because that's what's really correlated with deaths of despair, is that not only are things bad, but you have no hope that things are going to get better. For the 38% without hope, we got rid of all the people who said that they were lower, but they were still at 7 or higher, or like, that's okay. You still think life is going to be okay, even if it's worse. So this is a truly people who really expect to be struggling or suffering and are going to be much worse off. If you look at why and follow the orange and the gray, it's financial security, financial security, financial security. Loneliness and social support, though, were pretty high too. And what the care managers were able to do was rapidly begin to see who's suffering and without hope. Those are the ones that we need to send into crisis stabilization now. They actually redid their triage workflows across crisis and bridge and across the entire agency to make that possible. They stood up real-time caseload systems to make sure anybody who was just suffering or struggling got rapid follow-up within 24 hours or struggling within a week. And then if they were financially insecure, then they were screened for other social needs such as housing, food, etc., as well as support for employment services. If they were lonely, they got connected with a peer, and if they had, they did with other social supports. And then finally, they began and they created a warm line so that anybody could call in, and are looking at expanding platforms like Big White Wall, which are peer-to-peer supports that take care of the vast majority of people 24/7, 365. They, of course, made their hours themselves available 24/7, 365 to anybody who might need them, and changed all of their workflows so that when people came in and called in, they weren't trying to qualify for services. They were just getting routed to the help they need when they need it. Next slide. I think that I have already talked a little bit about what this data raises, but the important reason to look at this is because you would predict, and what we're seeing already is increases in deaths of despair, as well as other long-term stressors that would lead to increase in chronic, not just in things like family violence in the short term, but chronic disease outcomes in the long term. And until we can begin, what we've begun to do already is actually model some of this in the state to be able to predict, and across the country, which looks, if you know, it's too early at this point to really show that, but it seems right now like the number of deaths of despair might be about as much as the number of deaths from COVID, depending on which way the pandemic goes. Now, if you lift social distancing to if you don't do social distancing in a prolonged way, it's much worse. Like you'll have more COVID deaths, more deaths of despair, and worse economic losses. So this isn't a commentary on don't do social distancing. In fact, that would be much worse. But it is saying that we need to mitigate and have a strategy to mitigate against hopelessness, deaths of despair, and economic insecurity, and social connection. And that needs to be an intentional part of our COVID strategy, pandemic response strategy. And that's a lot of what the WIN response has been focusing on. Next slide. I've already shared with you some of how Delaware is using this data. Next slide. And this is sort of some of the triage protocols that they're following, which you can see when you see the slides. You can see they've taken that driver diagram and put together a whole set of COVID response strategies that really match the improvement of the population, and across sectors begin to help everybody collaborate so that police are diverting people from emergency rooms where they're not only be at risk for COVID, but actually risk the healthcare supply, and instead getting them into crisis stabilization. Corrections is operating in a similar way. They're working on de-incarcerating, et cetera, really thinking about, they've created peer drop-in groups and teams that can go out and meet people, beginning to work truly across the state, and with, of course, led by public health and DSAM to meet the needs of this population. Next slide. And the huge kudos, by the way, goes to Elizabeth Romero and Carol Rattay in Delaware, who have been really the visionary leaders behind this. You might have seen some of these health affairs pieces. Will the federal data strategy help communities win? For us, that means not just that, for instance, they use these particular measures, but really, are we set up as the federal data strategy to create measures that are identified as important by local communities? And do we make that data accessible to local communities in a way that doesn't harm them and can be accessible in a way that they really need? And then how do we create the foundation of a learning measurement system? And that's really what well-being in the nation is about, learning how to do these things. Stuart is asking, these interventions are both at the individual level as well as the location level. I'm not sure what you mean by the location level, Stuart. Some of them, of course, are like the Big White Wall and policy shifts are at the place-based level.
Well, this is Stuart. I was just asking, since a lot of these survey measures, I'm sure, are not available at the individual level, as you had that slide up there with the drivers and the outcomes, I was thinking that the outcomes would be more things that would be where interventions would be applied at a county, zip, census tract level. But am I hearing that they were also able to use this data to apply them at an individual level?
It's both. So
Okay,
they've been using it
I'm
both.
looking
and
forward to
it's-
diving into that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's that ability to think about people and measures that are useful for people at the individual level, together with measures that are useful at the community level. That's, I think, what creates the secret sauce behind some of this. It's part of what we need to facilitate that collaboration. Daniel, I think I'm just about done. Barbara was asking about stakeholders like law enforcement and policymakers who might have compassion fatigue. I think for law enforcement, things like years of life gained has been helpful because it feels like they can do something. And then, oh, thank you so much. The training efforts seem to often target the victim. And are masked as self-empowerment. So thank you so much for raising that. So a big part of what we have done is really help people across the state understand this from an equity lens, to actually do the training around that. So people, police officers across this entire state have had not only implicit bias and equity training, and are now seeing this themselves as part of creating system change to build the systems that actually help people to thrive. And they've been exposed to models of systems and bright spots in other states where law enforcement leading against diversion or others have led to substantial improvements in outcomes, so that they see that actually if you change the conditions, you can do better. And you know, one of the ways we knew we'd sort of broken through that was when they decided one of their first PDSAs was to create a get your, I think it's now called Because We Care van in the jail, in the parking lot of the jails and prisons, seeing that it was the jails that were the revolving door. They said that people don't necessarily trust us, especially for the detention population that's coming in and revolving out. But if we can create something where people can get their phones charged, and while they're getting their phones charged, they can get help and get connected, get rides, food, coffee, and get connected to mental health and treatment services, maybe we can drop the overdose rate that's there. And then for those in the prison population, really seeing that that's a place to treat mental health and addictions, and setting goals to scale up the people as well as the recovery, and setting goals in terms of the well-being they'd like to be able to see in that population. And finally, the introduction of peers across the system. This is truly not a measurement effort, it's a population health improvement effort. So the ability to see and value lived experience and of people who have not just recovered, but who can point out what those system barriers are, and processes that take, for instance, what we call stories to system change, where we can see the system, how it's failing people in the context of the story. See that often people are getting diverted at the age of 13 or 14. These things have been really important as part of a larger strategy to shift the system. Next slide. Paul is asking, how could we understand a common definition of well-being? I mean, in 100 Million, we said people define well-being for themselves. It's really how they rate their own lives. Now, in 100 Million, we looked at dimensions of mental, physical, social, spiritual, financial, and other dimensions of well-being that are in the well-being assessment, and you can get access to those tools and see that. Employers and Gallup has a whole set, but we've really thought about well-being as how people feel about their lives, and then how communities feel about their community. And ultimately, what we learned, of course, from Cantrell's ladder is that, and have known apparently in some sectors for decades, is how people feel about their lives matters. That it's not just evidence-based, it's far more evidence-based than most of what we use for pay for performance today in the healthcare sector, certainly. And that our ability to trust people, to know what they need in their lives, and to rate their own realities is something that we can actually use to move population level outcomes. So key takeaways, we actually have some measures that are useful across sectors that we could use as common, and they could help fuel collaboration across sectors. They need, of course, this broader frame of mindset shift and how we think about people and how we partner with people in the process. And that simple evidence-based measurement of well-being can be useful in both real-time measurement and for longer tracking of population health outcomes. And we're at the beginning of a journey of creating a learning measurement system. And we'd really love to think about how we go to a learning health and well-being system, but that we need both if we're going to get there. We look forward to partnering across networks. It's one of the things I love about Nick. And so I think this takes us to our last poll, which is really a question for all of you. If you had to think about what we need as part of a learning measurement system, these are the kinds of things we think about in WIN and questions we ask ourselves. How do we build a learning measurement system is something we ask in this cooperative, but there are others that are focused on narrative change and policy change, stories and dialogues, and actually moving the agenda together along with communities that are truly working to move these things, learn so that they're understanding can drive what we do at the policy level and not vice versa. And so as we begin to connect the dots across those, what do you think is most important if you go to the next slide in thinking about a learning measurement system to support a learning health and well-being system? But Sandy is saying we should enter our answers in the chat. This isn't a poll.
Or of course, if you want to speak about it, that's also good too. You can unmute yourself. We have a couple minutes to have some conversation on a few follow-up slides. Thank you so much for that. I guess one of the questions you mentioned here is it's distinct from a learning health system, and I'm assuming that you're drawing parallels between that initiative, that effort within the healthcare system, and if so.
Oh, I said a learning health and well-being system, Daniel. So I don't mean healthcare. I definitely mean across our sectors. Maybe we should just call it a learning well-being system.
Interesting. Yeah.
Dylan is saying community leadership, that it's whole family focused, is multi-generational. That was something we, in this next version of WIN, being multi-generational mattered. We need family partners and community member engagement, technical assistance and partnerships. And Matt is saying that we need to tie agency funding and incentives to drive action. And I think that our agency shared accountability across agencies and funding can help. Tying federal funding to some version of measures. Uma is saying that it needs to be ecosystem driven, and that there need to be a feedback loop of lessons learned. And that was very much part of what Karen DeSalvo and I wrote that paper on the learning measurement system to support a learning health and well-being system. And it's really that not a feedback loop, as well as like getting rid of measures that actually don't drive real outcomes, that don't matter to real people and communities, so that we have the space to measure the things that matter. From Barbara is saying historical propaganda or stories. We need community at the table and consider a possible crisis. I'd love to learn more about what you mean, Shabnam. We always say that you should never waste a good crisis, and this is certainly how we've leaned into this moment, so that we can begin to alleviate some of the suffering.
So one of the questions I have that comes back to sort of a systems thinking approach, which is, there's all this effort going on at the federal level within the healthcare, disease care environments, establishing, the networks, HIEs, the regional efforts, establishing protocols, system standards, and those kinds of things in order to align, reporting and access. I'm wondering what kind of strategies you're continuing to take, or new ones that you're continuing to take, to see if those measures, whether or not it's through ARC or through CMS or through ACF, are engaging with those measures so they become part of the actual requirements that grantees get or are required to think about.
So that's really why we formed the WIN network, Daniel. We knew no one of us could do this alone. with the WIN network and the Measurement and Learning Collaborative as a part of that cooperative really invites many of those groups in to be part of creating that change together, from the CDC and others. But that being, CMS has been very interested in this. Michelle Schreiber, I think, was might have been on at some point, but Michelle is fantastic. And it leads measurement at CMS. She's the one who's been really thinking about how we advance this forward as a core measure for health systems. And what we've said is, be careful, let's give people time to collect the measures, see them and learn first before, so that we really create that space for learning what creates well-being. The integration by public health into Healthy People 2030, it's already been integrated into the research and learning agenda, and now is under consideration as a leading health indicator. That would, of course, give it substantial shift, but it's really as Academy Health, ARC, and others move this forward across sectors. And the National Alliance is moving it forward to the human service sector in part. So, but really, in order to do this, we need partners who are willing to not just adopt common measures, but to come together and say, how can we learn together? What could we do together that we couldn't do alone? And I think no one's going to win this together. And the whole point of WIN is to create a space where across organizations, while I lead and founded We in the World, I come to WIN as a place to just invite others into the conversation and to partner with others like Stewards of Change and Nick and anybody else who wants to partner to say, how can we create a well-being system that truly advances what's needed?
Well, thank you for the presentation. The cards and letters continue to come in. I think that this, a couple here, if you can check in the chat box that you may want to address quickly.
Yeah. Paul, we totally agree about social cohesion. In fact, NCVHS put social cohesion and community vitality as one of the major domains of WIN from the very beginning. And that's something we've really leaned into, especially in this moment. The wrong pocket problem, Matt, is so essential to figure out. And that's really where the policies and investments part was set up to see. People said we need to solve that. And again, it's not one organization. There are over 100 organizations in the WIN network, but it really, until we can solve the wrong pocket problem at a policy level and the way budgets are structured, we're going to keep siloing ourselves.
I would suggest there's the ability to share information also between programs that are serving the same client within a state or jurisdiction are critical.
Totally agree, Daniel. I was so encouraged to see the action agenda that you are hoping that would help support interoperability across the determinants. It's so needed, and look forward to supporting in any way that we can.
Thank you. So that's a great segue. Just a few things before we close up here. One, again, thank you, Shoma, for presenting. And I hope as questions come in, we'll be posting all this material also on the NIC site as well as the WIN site. So if there's questions that come in, we'll look for your response and participation as we move into that, and really appreciate that a lot. As I mentioned at the start of the call, the next 2 weeks, there's some pretty interesting webinars coming up. A little more technical on the COVID in particular, about Indiana and some of the national accelerator sites. So we want to sort of prompt them around these WIN measures and make sure that all of them are well aware of them as they're developing systems and the ability to exchange information. We want to make sure we do that. And then, of course, ARC is going to be presenting on the 8th as well. And so as we finish, go to the next slide or so. Next couple of slides. Yeah, this one is that ARC one. And then if you can just go forward one more, I think we have one more slide there. Yep. So actually, there was a slide here that I wanted to mention, which was just a brief word on the action agenda. As I said at the top of the hour, we are looking to try to sort of consolidate or at least bring together the great thinking that's happening across the country and to at least sort of bring it together so that that we can avoid future duplication where necessary and really try to leverage the investments and energy that's been that's underway and underfoot, and that the needs for more of that will happen clearly over time and as we move into the next year. So you can find out more about the action agenda. You'll hear more about it. You'll see it on the next site, other places. And of course, we invite our colleagues and friends from WIN and from DASH and all in to be part of it. And everyone on here, if you go to the site, you can learn more about it and learn about how you can get involved. And with that, I want to just close out and thank you for, again, taking the time today and for everybody's participation. I'm excited about the work that you've been doing and look forward to learning more about it as we go forward. So,
Daniel, there's a question about whether the presentation or the recording will be emailed.
it won't be emailed, but it will be if you go to the Nick site. And Sundays, who's been managing the chat, can put it back up again here. You'll be able to click right on it and you'll see the video audio recording will be available. The slides will be available. And then there'll be actually a little section if you have questions, or one of the things we've been trying to support and encourage is ongoing dialogue and conversation. And I think that that is something that if people are sort of motivated or stimulated by the conversation, that's a great place to put your thoughts. And then we'll be publishing that. If you join the NIC, you'll get our weekly newsletter, which includes those kinds of conversations, also includes the references and upcoming and past events. So we encourage you to do that and to participate. And stay safe. Have a lovely weekend, whatever that may entail, wherever you are. And I look forward to seeing all of you again real soon. So thanks so much, Selma.